Hi, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about another important topic when it comes to critical thinking, and that's bias. Now, bias takes on a lot of different um, faces. Some of those, we sort of recognize as being very problematic, and other ones we don't. But I think that they're all sort of interrelated, because bias we'll see is just a very natural way that we tend to organize data. We're sort of bombarded with huge amounts of data, and bias is one way that we are able to deal with that. And so we're gonna take a look at that, um, both in its slightly less apparently less problematic version, and then we're going to look at it in terms of discrimination and prejudice. Most of what you're actually going to hear today is not going to come from me, but there's a set of videos on cognitive bias that are really helpful. So I want you to watch those, and the slide will pop up here in just a bit. Take a look at those, because those really get to the core of what bias is all about, and the ways that our minds tend to organize the information that we receive in a not particularly rational sort of way. So what you'll find, right, is that our sort of natural inductive reasoning capacities are not all that effective in coming to some sort of truth. Um, Although they are, some useful shortcuts occasionally. Quite often they get us to a place where it's not totally accurate. Now, what will happen then, right, is we'll then use that, so our minds will make us think that sort of we're on the right track in our conclusions, and we'll sort of apply that to areas in our lives that are really problematic when it comes to things like race and gender and so on. So let's take a look at that. So first of all, jumping to slide 2, just to sort of recognize there's this game, bowls, that was sort of where the term bias comes from. So in this game, there's one of the balls that's used is a weighted ball, and so when you throw it, it tends to veer one direction or the other, and so there's this bias, right? This tendency to go in a certain direction, and so British courts, this British game, there's British courts picked up this term to sort of describe what happens when a person or when a court tends to favor one side or the other in a way that's not fair, right, or not totally rational. And so that's how this term sort of finds its way into the legal system, and then eventually finds its way into sort of everyday use. Um, so bias. So slide 3, right? So basic definition of bias is a tendency to favor without rational basis. And what I want you to think about and sort of consider is can you find, right? Can you see where places of bias arise in your own life, right? Um, and then how has it affected you, right? How have you been sort of the subject of bias, right? And how have you sort of continued this tendency towards bias in your own life, right? So sort of both directions, and of course we all have experienced both of these. And then what's the source, right? Why do you have this particular bias? But that's all that we're going to be looking at, right? This sort of tendency to favor a particular sort of idea or position or data or whatever, without a rational basis. So we're going to look at 3 different areas, common sources of bias, and these can all come together in different ways, right? So cognitive biases, right? Again, this is just sort of a mechanism that we all have, or various mechanisms, right? There's not just one. There's a whole range of mechanisms that work to create a bias in our thinking. And then personal biases, right? We have a tendency to favor ourselves, and this is why, in various decision making situations, an individual is removed from that decision making. So if you think of sort of corporate law, or you think of in sort of political matters, in judicial matters, right? There's times when an individual either has to, assert that they have a personal bias in a situation. Not that they're going to act on that personal bias, right? This isn't sort of, saying that like this person is sort of wrong for being in this sort of situation, right? What it's saying is that there's a recognition that a decision that's being made has a potential personal benefit, and because it has a potential personal benefit, there's a personal bias in the situation. Okay, and then finally, prejudice, right? Prejudice is just a version of this where we tend to act a certain way. You can see my cat in the background wandering around. So prejudice is a tendency to act in a certain way according to particular features of a particular group, and we tend to treat different groups in different sorts of ways, and so this is prejudice, right? A prejudgment, right? We prejudge a person because they belong to a particular group. So those are three forms of bias that we're going to look at. Now, starting with cognitive bias, and this, for our purposes, at sort of the basic level, right, this is one of the most important areas that we're going to look at, because when it comes to critical thinking, right, these are those places where we need to be aware of, and at a very, be very careful about, because we can't always recognize these, but what we have to be able to do is learn to see them when they occur, right, or where they're likely to occur, and then be on the lookout for them, both for ourselves and for evaluating others. And so being able to diagnose one of these biases can be incredibly helpful, right? If you can sort of see this happening, see this occurring, one of these cognitive biases where you sort of like to see certain patterns, let's say, in the world, and so you see a pattern where there is not really a pattern. This can be really really useful tool to have. So cognitive biases are those that arise out of our network of belief, right? Our sort of past experiences. These biases arise, and we have this tendency to organize data, right, based on our old beliefs, right? The beliefs that we've had, our worldview. And when these come into conflict with reality, often we will sort of favor our beliefs over that. So that's what these sort of look like. Okay, so to remember, right, this is very similar to the coherence theory of truth, right? The coherence theory of truth is this idea of truth that says that what I accept as true is something that that fits with the previous knowledge that I already have. Okay, so please follow this link, and it'll take you to a playlist of descriptions, right, of different forms of cognitive biases. And these are nice because they have sort of all this visual stuff that really helps explain that. So I find it a little bit easier for students in sort of the online version to understand if they can watch these. So watch that. So pause this video, you can watch that, and then come back to this. That's slide 6. Okay, moving to slide 7. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but self-interested biases, right? These are the types of biases that we have based on just, because we have a particular self-interest in decisions that we make, and these are group decisions, right? Decisions that are supposed to be intended to benefit an entire group, but we may benefit by one of these decisions, and so there's conflict of interest, right? Issues that might arise or might arise by appearance, and so we often need to be very cautious of these biases. Right. But what I want to do now is spend a little more time, not a lot, but a little more time on prejudice, because sort of in our world today, we're sort of recognizing where prejudice arises in a better way, but it's becoming more and more clear that these things influence our decisions in all sorts of areas that we previously didn't even recognize. So we think of what prejudice is, right? And it sort of fits, it sort of arises from the term itself, prejudgment. So a judgment, right, is making a sort of a value decision about something, right? You sort of, sort of the classic example here, right? You have, you're on a hiring committee, and you have, 5 candidates who otherwise are, fully qualified for a job. But you prejudge right before the interview, looking at the resumes, for example. You sort of get a sense about the lives of these people, or you may, sort of make certain leaps in judgment based on what you see on the resume about certain people, and so you find a way, either consciously or unconsciously, and that's one of the big problems of these is these are so often unconscious. You make certain decisions about these people and sort of throw them out of consideration prior to even looking fully at the applicant and having an interview and so on. Right, and there's lots of ways that we can sort of deal with these problems. We can have committees, for example, in the hiring process. We can make sure that those committees are diverse to try to deal with some of these things and have sort of discussions about that. We can have audits of these. A lot of different things can be done to try to fix for these various biases, these various prejudices, but they can't all be fixed all the time. Right. And so it's, again, one of these places, sort of being aware of them can make our own decision making more fair and more appropriate. And, we can also be aware when it occurs, where we witness it, right, where we can try to sort of deal with these. So, so how do we define this, right? Prejudice can be defined as an attitude or feeling towards another person or group that are preconceived. These are largely irrational beliefs, right? They're not based on any sort of rational basis, right? And we could track a lot of these just back to various fallacies, that we've talked about, right? It can be tradition, right? Might be one of the fallacies, right? Or we might sort of give a certain person or a certain set of ideas sort of give them authority over something or so on. So that rather than sort of continuing to sort of discuss this, take a look at this video on prejudice and discrimination and get a sense of it on slide 10 there. Okay, and finally, slide 11. What does it mean to be unbiased, right? To be unbiased, right? Now I don't know that sort of being unbiased is something that is completely possible, but these but that's something I think that is important to consider is how can we come as close as possible to being unbiased, right? To sort of sort of keeping bias outside of our decision making. Um, because we can't be unbiased, right? Can we ever fully evaluate controversial claims? Well, first of all, it's sort of looking at multiple perspectives, right? Sort of find perspectives that are different than your own and review those perspectives, right? That can be something that is very helpful in trying to be unbiased. Um, try to be empathetic in your thinking, sort of expanding your empathy, right? This can be done in a lot of ways. Reading other people's perspectives. I think reading literature can be very helpful in this. Watching movies can be helpful in this. Traveling can be helpful in this. Locating our own experience of bias, so seeing where we have been biased in our own lives, or where we have been the victim of bias. Right, that's another place where we can work towards um, um, work towards unbias. And then finally, self-reflection and welcoming the opinions of others. Right. And I don't mean just sort of tokenly welcoming the opinion of others, saying like, oh, I'm going to sort of allow this person to speak and then just ignore what they have to say, but truly welcoming the opinions of others and being open to those opinions can be another place of trying to accept, or excuse me, undermine our own biases. Right. This sort of work is difficult because we have to, in order to do this, we have to have a little bit of humility, right? We have to have a little bit of willingness to sort of see our own weaknesses and to deal with our own defensiveness. So, and the better we're able to do that, the better we're going to be able to deal with some of these biases. All right. So that's all we've got for today. So just a couple more classes to go, and the course will be over. Thanks for watching.